April 1945. The war in Europe is entering its final brutal weeks. American forces push deeper into Germany, liberating concentration camps and prisoner-of-war facilities. But among the thousands they free, there's a group of women whose stories would remain largely untold for decades. Soviet female soldiers who endured a nightmare that combined the horrors of combat, captivity, and systematic sexual violence. Before we begin, if you value detailed, respectful storytelling like this, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps more people discover these forgotten histories and allows me to keep creating documentaries like this one. What happened when these women, brutalized by their captors and expecting the worst from their liberators, encountered American GIs? The answer reveals not just a powerful moment of humanity in wartime, but also the complex and often tragic fate that awaited these women even after liberation. This is the story of the Soviet women POWs, who were shocked when American soldiers treated them with respect. To understand the shock these women experienced, we first need to understand who they were and what they endured. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the scale of the conflict was unprecedented. The Eastern Front would become the deadliest theater of World War II, claiming over 25 million Soviet lives. Facing an existential threat, the Soviet Union took an extraordinary step. It mobilized women for combat on a scale never seen before or since. By war's end, nearly 1 million Soviet women had served in the Red Army. While most served in traditional support roles as medics, communications specialists, and anti-aircraft gunners, thousands fought as snipers, tank drivers, pilots, and infantry soldiers. These weren't women playing support roles far from the front lines. Many were combat troops facing the same dangers as their male counterparts. Women like Zoya Smirnova, who served as a reconnaissance scout, or Klavdia Kalugina, a fighter pilot who flew combat missions, or the countless medics who crawled under fire to drag wounded soldiers to safety. These women volunteered to defend their homeland, often driven by personal loss. Fathers, brothers, husbands killed in the German advance. But the Wehrmacht and SS had specific policies regarding captured Soviet women soldiers. Nazi ideology viewed Soviet women combatants with particular contempt. They were Slavs, communists, and women who had violated traditional gender roles by taking up arms. This intersection of racial ideology, political hatred, and misogyny created a perfect storm of brutality. When captured, Soviet women soldiers faced immediate and systematic abuse. Wehrmacht and SS units routinely subjected female POWs to rape and sexual slavery. Unlike male prisoners of war, who faced brutal conditions in camps, women were often separated and subjected to organized sexual violence before being sent to camps, if they survived that long. The term comfort women typically refers to the Japanese military's system of sexual slavery. But while the Germans never created an official system comparable to Japan's organized comfort stations, the reality for many captured Soviet women was functionally similar. Systematic sexual violence perpetrated by enemy forces, often with the knowledge or participation of military authorities. German military brothels did exist, and some Soviet women POWs were forced into them. But much of the sexual violence was less organized and more chaotic. Individual units holding women for their use, SS officers keeping women as personal slaves, camp guards systematically abusing female prisoners. By 1945, thousands of Soviet women had survived this nightmare. Held in camps, forced labor facilities, or kept by specific military units, they had endured years of captivity, abuse, and violence. They had watched fellow prisoners die from disease, starvation, and execution. Many had been repeatedly raped. All had been dehumanized by an enemy that viewed them as subhuman. And then the Americans arrived. Picture the scene. American forces are advancing through Germany in spring 1945. They're encountering POW camps, forced labor facilities, and displaced persons by the thousands. The soldiers of the US Army have seen terrible things. The devastation of combat, the horrors of concentration camps like Buchenwald and Dachau. But they're unprepared for what they see in the eyes of the Soviet women they liberate. When American soldiers first encountered groups of Soviet women POWs, they noticed something disturbing. The women would often cower, huddle together in corners, or try to hide. Some would plead in broken German or Russian. Others would simply go silent and still, their faces blank. A response soldiers would later recognize as dissociation, the mind's protection against expected trauma. The women expected to be raped. After years of sexual violence at the hands of German captors, they had learned that liberation by new soldiers simply meant new abusers. They had no reason to believe that men in different uniforms would treat them any differently. But American soldiers, by and large, did something the women didn't expect. They treated them as human beings who had suffered, not as objects to be used. Now we need to be clear here. The American military in World War II was not perfect. There were incidents of sexual violence committed by US forces in Europe. Historians have documented cases of rape by American soldiers, particularly in the immediate chaos of combat zones. The US military of 1945 was also a segregated force with its own deep problems of racism and inequality. But in the specific interactions between American soldiers and Soviet women, POWs, something different often occurred. Multiple accounts from survivors and soldiers describe American GIs offering food, medical care, and basic respect, rather than continuing the cycle of abuse. Why the difference? Several factors contributed to this. First, American military culture and training emphasized discipline and military justice. While enforcement was imperfect, the US military did prosecute soldiers for rape. There were consequences, at least sometimes, that didn't exist in the Wehrmacht or SS. Second, Americans were liberators entering defeated enemy territory, not an occupying force that had fought a brutal multi-year campaign on this ground. The context was different from the Eastern Front's years of total war and mutual atrocities. Third, and perhaps most importantly, many American soldiers were genuinely horrified by what they were witnessing in the camps. The shock of seeing concentration camp victims, starving POWs, and evidence of systematic atrocities created a sense that these people needed protection and help, not further abuse. Witness accounts describe American soldiers sharing rations with freed prisoners, even though their own supplies were limited. Medics treating women's injuries with gentleness and care. Soldiers using translators or hand gestures to communicate that the women were safe now, that they wouldn't be harmed. One survivor recalled years later how an American soldier offered her chocolate and smiled, actually smiled, with no expectation of anything in return. Another remembered a medic who carefully examined her injuries and got angry, not at her, but at what had been done to her. She'd never seen a man angry on her behalf before. It sounds simple, basic human decency, but to women who had been systematically brutalized for years, this basic respect was shocking. Imagine having learned through terrible experience that men in uniforms mean violence and violation, that the only question is how bad it will be this time, that resistance means death, and compliance means survival, however degraded. And then encountering men in different uniforms who give you food instead of taking it, who provide blankets instead of ripping them away, who call for medics instead of inflicting new injuries, who look at you with pity or anger at your condition, but not at you. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming. Some women reportedly took days to believe they were actually safe. Others remained wary, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The trauma didn't simply evaporate because the threat had changed. But slowly, many of the women began to understand that something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer considered objects. They were being treated as people again. But here's where this story takes a tragic turn, because for many of these Soviet women, their ordeal wasn't over. In fact, in some ways, the worst was yet to come. The American soldiers who liberated them treated them with respect and compassion. The Soviet system they returned to often did not. Stalin's Soviet Union viewed POWs with deep suspicion. The official ideology held that a good Soviet soldier would fight to the death rather than surrender. Those who were captured were seen as potential traitors, or at minimum as weakened and contaminated by exposure to the enemy. Stalin had issued Order Number 270 in 1941, which stated that soldiers who surrendered were traitors to the motherland. While this order was later modified, the stigma remained. Soviet POWs who survived German captivity often faced interrogation by SMERSH, Soviet counterintelligence, rather than celebration upon their return. For women, this suspicion was even worse. If male POWs were suspected of collaboration or cowardice, women POWs faced additional judgment. The unspoken question hung over them: what had they done to survive? The answer, everyone assumed, was sexual. It didn't matter that these women had been victims of systematic sexual violence. In Soviet society of that era, the shame of rape attached to the victim, not just the perpetrator. Women who had been raped were considered spoiled or damaged. If they'd been captive for years, the assumption was they'd been collaborators, or at minimum had voluntarily engaged in sexual relationships with the enemy to survive. This attitude pervaded not just official institutions, but Soviet society at large. The patriarchal culture of the time had little understanding of sexual violence as something forced upon women rather than something they somehow brought upon themselves. So when these women were repatriated to the Soviet Union through established Allied agreements, many faced harsh interrogations. Had they revealed military secrets? Had they collaborated? Had they fraternized with the enemy? The women found themselves in an impossible position. If they revealed the sexual violence they'd endured, they risked being labeled as shameful or suspect. If they stayed silent, the authorities assumed they were hiding collaboration. And throughout, there was the terrible irony. American soldiers, the supposed enemy in the developing Cold War, had treated them better than their own people now did. Some women were sent to filtration camps, essentially Soviet prison camps, where returnees were screened. These camps had terrible conditions, and inmates could be held for months or years while investigated. Others were released, but denied party membership, good jobs, or educational opportunities. Their wartime service was forgotten or erased. Many women simply never spoke about what happened to them. They returned to their homes if those homes still existed. They married if they could find husbands who would accept them. They tried to rebuild lives in a society that viewed them with suspicion at best, contempt at worst. There are documented cases of women who were decorated war heroes before their capture. Snipers with dozens of confirmed kills, pilots who'd flown combat missions, medics who'd saved countless lives, reduced to menial work and social pariahs because of their captivity. The poet Vera Inber wrote after the war, "There is no greater tragedy than a woman warrior who returns home to find she is still in enemy territory." For decades, these women's stories remained untold. Soviet histories emphasized male military heroism and glossed over the complicated reality of female soldiers. When female military service was discussed, it was usually confined to a few well-known heroes whose stories fit the propaganda narrative. Women who died heroically or whose service could be framed in ways that avoided uncomfortable questions. The women who'd been captured, abused, and survived. Their stories didn't fit the narrative. They were erased from history. It wasn't until Glasnost in the late 1980s that many of these stories began to emerge. Soviet veterans finally felt able to speak about experiences that didn't fit the official narrative. Historians began to investigate the fate of POWs more honestly, and some of the women, now elderly, finally began to tell their stories. What emerged was a picture of extraordinary complexity. These were women who had volunteered to defend their country, who had served with courage, who had endured unspeakable horrors in captivity, who had survived against the odds, and who had then been treated as shameful embarrassments by the country they'd fought for. But also woven into their stories was this moment, this singular, unexpected moment, when American soldiers had treated them with basic human dignity, when men in uniforms had chosen to offer help instead of harm. Why does this matter now, 80 years later? First, because these women's stories deserve to be told. They were written out of history for decades. Their service, their suffering, and their survival should be acknowledged and honored. Second, because this history illuminates the intersection of warfare, sexual violence, and how societies treat women who transgress traditional gender roles. The Soviet women soldiers experienced violence partly because they were POWs, but also specifically because they were women who had taken up arms. Their treatment by both German captors and Soviet society afterward reflected deep-seated attitudes about women's proper place. Third, because the contrast between how these women were treated by their liberators and their own people raises uncomfortable questions about nationalism, heroism, and how societies processed trauma. The American soldiers who showed them kindness were not inherently more moral than Soviet citizens. They were simply outside the Soviet system's need to maintain a certain narrative about captivity and heroism. And finally, because the moment when these women realized they would not be harmed, when they grasped that they were safe, represents something fundamental about human dignity. In the midst of history's most destructive war, in a context of almost unimaginable brutality, some individuals chose basic decency. That matters. It mattered to those women in 1945. It matters to understanding our capacity for both cruelty and kindness. And it matters as a reminder that how we treat the most vulnerable in moments of power reveals who we really are. The Soviet women, POWs, who survived German captivity, carried their trauma for the rest of their lives. Many never fully recovered from what they endured. Most faced continued difficulties in Soviet society. Some never spoke about their experiences until the very end of their lives, if at all. But in interviews conducted decades later, some of them would mention that moment of unexpected kindness from American soldiers. The chocolate offered freely, the respectful medical care, the absence of the violence they'd learned to expect. In lives marked by suffering, those moments of basic human decency stood out. They were reminded that not all men in uniforms were the same, that not all power would be abused, that they could perhaps still be seen as human beings deserving of respect. It was a small thing in the vast sweep of history, but to the women who experienced it, it was everything. The story of Soviet women, POWs, in World War II is one of courage, horror, unexpected mercy, and tragic homecoming. These women served their country, survived hell, encountered surprising humanity, and then were erased from the history they'd helped make. Remembering them now is our obligation. Their stories deserve to be part of how we understand the war, how we grapple with military sexual violence, and how we think about the treatment of women in conflict. They were soldiers, they were survivors, and in one unexpected moment, they were treated with the respect they'd always deserved.